I don't even remember if this was my my intro music, but I like it. I like it. You are listening to the Mr. Josh Podcast. We're coming to you live from the Space Coast Podcast Studios, sunny South Florida, sunny Central Florida, South Florida. My heart still in the South. What if the South had won? They didn't. Remember you always see those bumper stickers? What if the South had won? I guess you had to be a Florida cracker to know from that. Anyways, let's jump in. We're here at the podcast studios, Space Coast Podcast Studios, with Jesse, the engineer behind the knobs and switches. Always a good time, folks. You're with Mr. Josh here. I'm wearing my New York Giants hat. I don't tend to wear hats all that often because I have good hair, and hats can hurt your hair. But I got this hat here, and what side is it? Is it this side? Yeah. And there's a story with, I got a Lawrence Taylor autograph, and I may have told it before about coming into Porky's, and it was a really cool thing that he used to come in, and he was a customer of ours for about 7-8 months, and just a really down-to-earth cool guy. He was my favorite player when I was a kid growing up, and really actually cared about sports on a level way more than I do now. But to just have your favorite player show up to your place of employment is really, really cool. And then to find out like what his habits were downstairs, or even funnier. And then to find out in the VIP room, I say downstairs, like, you know, and to find out what he's doing in the VIP room. And he was, he was a tender guy. He had a tender touch. And God bless you, Lawrence Taylor. He's still down in South Florida living life, and he's staying out of trouble. I think that's really, really cool. This episode I'm going to do is a little different from what I've done before, because I think that I want to inform people. I'm a pretty sharp guy, I like to think, and I've given some information through my podcast with relevant information, whether it's about how I feel about this or that, and how I grew up. And I also have another podcast that we do called Ruthless Politics, Kid Chronic and Trees. So you can check that out, ruthlesspolitics.com. And that podcast on Budsprout and iTunes and all that good stuff, where we talk politics and my side, as opposed to Kid Chronic's side. He's the lib and I am the smart guy. Anyways, this is going to be a gambling and fantasy football 101, a crash course for people that either don't know, want to get involved in this. If you haven't by now, you probably already have, but if you haven't, and you need, there's so many people you can get information from, but I'm going to try to differentiate myself, and I have nothing to prove. There's no winnings I can explain to you this or that, but I'm going to give you some good information so you can sharpen your skills in both of these worlds. In this particular case, it's going to be football, NFL football gambling, not even college. But let me tell you my background when it comes to gambling, and I'm going to go over a couple of key points on what I think are ways to have a better shot at winning or losing in this gambling world. My father gambled. I remember seeing on the side of his table, he had the lines and the games that he bet, and I guess the amounts, whether he won or lost, whatever. So I started to notice that my father somehow, some way had a bookie. This was when I was a kid living in Florida. And so I knew my father gambled, and he was a sports guy. And to give you an idea, I am a Raiders fan primarily. I'm a Giants fan secondarily. How did I become a Raiders fan? I lived in South Florida, where it was Dolphin Central, and I was blessed to be a child of the 80s. So living down here, we got to see Dan Marino live and in action right from 1984. So I was 8 years old. And Dan Marino he was the shit. And I mean, it was exciting because he was right here. He was a hometown guy, although he's from Pittsburgh. But professionally, it was a hometown guy. So you almost forced to really get into football down here if you weren't into NFL, like you were going to be. And right before Dan Marino got really huge, that first year he came, the Raiders were in the Super Bowl against the Washington Redskins. And I remember that was the first game I kind of even paid attention to. And that game, the Raiders kick Washington's ass, and there's a phenomenal run by Marcus Allen where he starts to cut up field. Well, he starts to go one way, and then the Redskins are coming, and he turns, and he cuts up field, and then winds up taking like 80 yards. And it's just one of the most incredible runs in such a big game. And so I was a front runner, and I was a kid, and it was just like, oh, the Raiders are the team. They had the cool uniform, and the rest, as you know, the NWA hats and all that shit. And the Raiders became such a hip team to be, affiliated or cool with. I was liking the Raiders when it wasn't quite so cool, but the Raiders were just the team. And then the Giants became a thing because my father, New Yorker, my whole family New Yorkers, and he was a Giants fan, so I just kind of went with what my dad liked as well. So I was just the two teams that I followed. And at the time when I was getting on board, Lawrence Taylor was there. And again, going back to Dan Marino. So it was a great time for football, which got me, that was my introduction to the NFL. Fast forward, how did I get into gambling? My aunt had an office pool, a really big office pool that had almost like $1,000 weekly prize. Now, office pools were illegal. If you remember, they still technically are. I guess, but office pools were illegal, but this was at a place that didn't seem to care too much, and it was well organized, and she didn't know anything, so she let me and my dad make her picks, and eventually he just deferred it to me. He didn't really care, so I always made her picks, and if she ever won, and we won a couple times, she would throw me a little bit of cash. So this was very fun for me. So what I wound up doing in 9th grade was I used to take my aunt's sheet, her pool sheet, with all of my picks on them. And I was not a Dolphins fan, Jesse, so I would always pick against the Dolphins. I always picked against the Dolphins. Now, I did this against the spread, and I'm going to explain to you what a spread is in a bit. But so it wasn't just picking winners. You had to pick against the spread. And I always went against the Dolphins. And what I did was in 9th grade, I had friends that were all into sports. And I would take my sheet of the picks that I made for her, and I became the house. I was the Vegas. And what I did was I would allow any kids in my classes or people that wanted to they would bet against my sheet. So they all took the Dolphins against me. So my largest action every week was the Dolphin game because I never took them. So everybody would take the Dolphins because we were all that lived down here. And but people would just look on my sheet, and whatever they disagreed with, that was what they would place a bet. $3, $5, some kid had a lot of money, $10. So, I was just about, was I going to come ahead or not, was because they were all, canceling each other out. Some were winners, some were losers and all that. So I became like the bookie of the school and got in trouble for that on a small level. When I did that in 9th grade, which was in 1989, that old, I met a dude, and I'll just call him Ad. And Ad was a big Beastie Boys fan, so I'll call him Ad Rock. And Ad Rock was a football card kid and a baseball card kid like me and all that, and he loved football, and he would bet against my stuff. And he asked me, have you ever played fantasy football before? And I said, fantasy football, what is it? He said, well, it's basically the same as rotisserie baseball. Now, rotisserie baseball, I don't know if you remember, but rotisserie baseball, that was the first fantasy game that ever existed. And rotisserie baseball was much harder than fantasy football because it was a daily grind. So it wasn't a once a week or a Thursday, Saturday, Thursday, Sunday kind of thing. This was an everyday lineup thing. And you had to put them in for the week. So you had to do scout pitchers and scout who had more games. You may have a better player, but for the week, he may have one less game than the other guy. So anyways, rotisserie baseball was always a much nerdier, tougher RPG, so to speak. I mean, your Dungeons and Dragons sports people, I guess, were the people that got really into rotisserie baseball because it was pretty hardcore. Fantasy football was such a lighter version. One lineup, once a week, less stats, very easy. So he introduced me to that, and I joined a league with him in 9th grade. So 1989, I think I was 18 in 93. So my first fantasy football experience at 44 years old now was literally like 15 years old. So that's how long I've been playing this game we call fantasy. How did fantasy football blow up? Well, it just did over time. It couldn't be denied. And then the gambling aspect of fantasy football, we're going to get into as well. So that gives you a little bit of the background. I've been playing fantasy football for a very long time. I actually won that inaugural year with Ad Rock. There was only 6 of us, so the teams were loaded. And I remember that I actually had Jerry Rice and I had Steve Young on. Like, if you had those 2 fucking guys, man, are you kidding me? And I remember I had Neil Anderson and James Brooks. And it was just, I mean, these are names that, you have to really know football to know from back in the 80s, leading into the 90s. What a different game. So many changes, so many variables to everything. Some good, some bad. I've actually tried to talk about the decline of the NFL and, and what might really do it in, but that's for another time. Let's get into Gambling 101, and then we're going to talk about Fantasy 101. So this would be a good time to kind of segue right now into that. So, Gambling 101. So let's talk about first, when you're reading a line or a spread, what exactly is that? So the best way to describe that, you've probably seen somehow, some way, is you'll see Dolphins, and it may be in capital letters because they're home, and then a number, and then the other team. And in this case, I'm going to say Dolphins 5 Jets. So what does that mean? Dolphins are on the left. That means they are the favorite. The favorite means that they are more likely to win the game. So the odds are that they will be the winner. That number in the middle is what Vegas uses to even out the betting. So that 5 means we know people are going to take the Dolphins. That's the easy pick. But will you take them if they have to win by 5 points, in this case, or more? So against the Jets. So that's their way of getting people to take the Jets. Because if you make it where it's harder to win by having to cover a point spread, you're getting more people to take the other side. So why would they take the other side? Because in order to win this bet, the Dolphins have to, not only win the game, but they have to win the game by 5 or more. Now, if the spread is 5 and they win by 5, it's a push, it's a tie, the bet gets thrown away. Sometimes you'll see where it could be 5.5. If it's 5.5, that means that you have no tie possibilities at that point, but what you do have is a winner or loser only, because there is no way to get a half a point. So at that point, the Dolphins would have to win by 6. There will be no ties. It's just win or lose that bet, and that's when you see a half involved in your spread. So picking the Dolphins, they must now win by 6 or more in order to win that bet. However, if you take the Jets, what that means is that not only if the Jets win, you win the bet, but also if the Jets lose by 5.5 or less. So, for instance, if they lose so if you have the spread at 5.5 and it's called a spread, you will then have the ability to win by winning the game. And then if the Jets lose by 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1, or if the game happens to tie, unlikely. But that being said, so you have all the different ways to win as an underdog. They're pushing you to take underdogs because of that fact. So that's a very simple way to read that line. Now, how much do you win? How much do you lose when you bet on these? These are straight bets. That's called a straight bet, and it's basically minus 110. So what does minus 110 means is that Vegas and bookies really make their money on what's called the vig. And what the vig is it's a penalty. It's a 10% penalty for them placing your bet for you. So when you bet $100, you're going to lose 110 on the bet. You understand? So that's the 10% on the 100. There's a penalty basically for them taking the bet, because ultimately what these folks are trying to do is to have equal bets on both sides and just keep pocketing the 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. There's no risk. There's no loss. It's just always getting that middle piece. That's what Vegas is trying to do. And that's, again, what the whole concept of a point spread is so that it tries to push you to the other side. The more money that goes on one side, for instance, the Dolphins started at 5 on a Tuesday. Now they're a 7. What that means is more and more money keeps going on the Dolphins. Vegas is adjusting the line to push you toward the other side. So they're making it even higher for the Dolphins to cover and win that game. They're trying to push the money the other way to the other team. In this case, we were talking about the Jets. So it goes to 7. If it keeps going on the Dolphins, it'll go to 7.5 or 8. If money starts going back on the Jets, it'll bring that line down. Lines do fluctuate. That's another thing, like the stock market. So when you're betting, if you like a line a lot for a particular team, you may want to get in on it because that line can and will change based on where you put that action in. Now, as you know, there's many different places you can place action. Action, a term for what a bet is or what gambling is. You'll hear the term action. You know, he takes action, or I put some action on this game. So, but basically, it's just a slang term. You have your illegal bookmakers, people that you can just call and will take a bet for you, and then you have your online services. Gambling is pretty much been legalized now all throughout the country. It's just a matter of time. So there's going to be all sorts of apps and ways to do this very easily and very simply. So that's just going to continue to happen and grow. So that gives you an idea of what a line is. Now, there's also what they have are called also money lines. And what a money line is if the game is close enough, if there's a big disparity in the game, they typically will not do money lines. But you will see the favorite will have a number with a negative next to it, and then the underdog will have a number next to it with a positive. So, for instance, you will see Patriots minus 700 and then Tampa Bay plus 400 in their game. There's no point spread now in the middle. So now you're able to just pick a winner. So there is no spread that you have to cover. You can just pick a winner. However, the difference now is how much you're putting up and how much you're winning. That minus 700, and I'll use this to use square numbers here, you have to put up 700 to win 100. And that would be how the ratio would then work further. So if you wanted to win $100, you're going to lose 700. That's how much of a favorite the Patriots are. And vice versa, if you like Tampa Bay, they are plus 400. What that means is for every 100 you put up, using 100 as the square number figure here, you would win 400. So you're winning way more by taking that underdog. Again, now you're just picking that underdog to win. There's no point spread again. So it's very unlikely they're going to win that game. There's a financial reward to them winning by you winning 400 on your 100. Whereas the obvious team that's going to win, the Patriots, well, they're not going to financially reward you for picking an easy winner. So they're basically saying, well, you have to pay the equivalent. So to win that 100, nobody's saying you have to put up 700. But for instance, if you, let's just say you put a $50 wager, well, you're going to win like $10. You're going to win $8. So it's much more of a gamble. Now, they're not always that big of a disparity. There are games that are much closer. You know, a team could be minus 200 to another team that's plus 100. And that's a much closer matchup, more of a coin toss matchup. Another bet is what they refer to as over-unders. Boy, this thing goes off so quickly. So over-unders are when you take the total score of the game and you just add the two teams' final score, and you're determining to yourself, is this game going to go over or under this total score that we're picking here? So, for instance, 48 is a common over-under. Is this game, with the total combined score of the two parties, going to go over or under 48? Here's one of the things that I've learned in gambling as well. Over-unders are very hard to bet. Straight games are hard to bet. In the NFL is a tough bet. It's basically a 50-50 split. Somebody, and I wish I could find it. I couldn't find it. But somebody did and went back and took every game of the NFL since the merger, since it was like the NFL, and every game, and then went and took the against the spread records of everybody. And if you can believe it, the favorites were only 15 games. Think about this, Jesse. For all the games that have been played, there's been thousands of games since this time. There was only a 15-game difference of the favorites covering the spread over underdogs. That's how close it was. That's how much of a coin toss NFL. It's that hard to pick a game because it really is a 50-50 proposition. What they also found out was that over-unders were much the same way. I actually found out last year, I was writing articles and doing recaps for every week, and it was even closer than the 15. And interestingly enough, last year, it was underdogs cashed in more than favorites last year in the NFL. Make a note of this. The underdogs cashed in more than the favorites by about 11 games. But it was still that close. Hundreds of games played. What is it, 16 games a week? Times 17 weeks, give or take. So, wow, that's a pretty tough call. Over-unders were even closer. So, it's really, NFL gambling is very tough. Before I go into some of the other types of bets, I want to explain one thing because I've just veered off into talking about gambling on the NFL and how hard it is. A couple of bits of advice. Why do people win and why do people lose in gambling? First of all, more than likely you are going to lose. Okay, so you have to understand that about the whole situation. You are probably going to lose your money. And one of the reasons why you lose is because you get greedy or you bet with your heart. You make some of the crucial mistakes that people make. So you're probably saying, okay, so what are some of these crucial mistakes? Some of these crucial mistakes that people make, number one, is betting with their heart. You can't bet on your favorite team every week. You can't just because you want them to win. You're going to lose money that way. That's number one. That's just a cardinal sin. Do not do it. That's one of the first things you learn. Don't specifically bet on your team, number one. Number two, let's take this off 1 second here. Hold on. Okay. Number two, this is the biggest problem that happened and why gambling, I believe, exploded. And gambling's always been, this is a vice, by the way, people, that is as big as any. It's as big as drugs. It's as big as guns. It's as big as everything. There's as much money going in on gambling as there's absolutely any vice. I think maybe prostitution might be more because sex is more compulsive, I think, than winning money. But I don't know. It's probably damn close. One of the biggest mistakes and problems people make, we have all suffered from this, is that you bet on games just because they are on TV. If you are a real gambler and you're betting on college football and pro football, do you understand that? So the college bettor, for instance, they've got their their Saturday 12 o'clock games, and then there's the 3:30 games, and then there's the 7 o'clock games. And these are where they typically are televised, where they're broken down, where they put them into their categories. So you have noon, 3:30. 3:30 is where the huge matchup is. That's your Alabama, Florida, a lot of times. You know what I mean? Or your, Oklahoma, Texas at 3:30. That's where CBS puts that 3:30 Whopper game. And then ABC puts on that 8 o'clock game. And that's where you get your Clemson, Florida State at 8 p.m. And you get those big. So one of the things people started doing is they have to bet every game that's on TV. I have to bet every game that's on TV. Well, guess what? Those are the hardest games to bet. They're the closest matchups. Those are your toughest games. There's no value there. You're betting on games that are literally -3. Now, let me make a point also. -3. When you see a spread like that, so-and-so, 3, so-and-so, that means that is a complete coin toss game. It means that it is completely even, and the team typically in Vegas gets 3 points their way for being the home team. So you will many times see in the gambling world a team 3-point spread versus another team. That basically tells you that game is as even as it gets. That is as even as it gets. They're giving them the 3 just for being in their home stadium. Now, going back to the common stakes. So the NFL starts putting on Thursday games. The NFL starts putting on Saturday games later in the season. So you got Thursday night game. You got Saturday game half the year. You've got Sunday at 1 o'clock. You got Sunday at 4 o'clock. And you got Sunday at 8 o'clock. And you got Monday. At its peak, you have 6 games. 6 games to bet on, as well as all the others. But those 6 games, people bet them. They find their way. And if they lost the 1 o'clocks, how do I regroup and win at the 4 o'clocks? So they just start trying to chase the money. You're chasing the money. You're chasing the money. And these are some common mistakes that people make. You can't bet just on the games that are on TV. Those are the ones you actually want to avoid. One of the things I learned in the gambling world, and I had bookies teach me and tell me, because what I eventually started to do was I became a runner. My best friend in New York at the time, we'll call him Louie Lou. He had a family member that was involved in bookmaking, and I got a line with him, and then we started to work under him and run and try and get clients, and then you get a piece of their losses. So I this is where I really cut my teeth and learned a lot about this business, this industry, and how it all worked, and what all the different bets were and whatnot. And so this is where you started to see people and how they made these common mistakes and what they did wrong. So that was how I learned a lot of this. Was I actually did this after high school at some point in my life when I was living in New York. So some of the other common bets that you will see. Let me bring this here for 1 second. It's right in my face over there. Let's put it this here. Okay. So move this here. Okay. So what I want to talk to you about is some of the other bets we're going to just shoot over real quick, and this is just a reminder to me. So if you're not going to do straight bets and you're not going to do over-unders, there's other sorts of games and fun ways that you can bet that also increase your chances of winning and the bigger payoffs. So you may have heard of what's called a parlay, okay? So what is a parlay? A parlay is basically taking multiple straight bets and saying, okay, if you win all of these games, multiple games you're going to pick, you're going to increase your money winnings infinitely times 10, times 15, times 20. So, for instance, you can do a 2-team parlay, a 3-team, a 4-team, a 5-team. You can do up to like a 10-team if you want. And basically what that means is you're picking 10 games or 6 games or 4 games. And you will then get a multiplier on how much you've put up. So the thing is that you have to win every one of the games. So it can be very tough. So if you take a 4-team parlay, typically you'll win 12 times your money. If you do a 5-team parlay, typically you'll win 25 times your money. But winning 5 games, boy, isn't that that's pretty hard to do, wouldn't you think? So that is what a parlay is. And then there's such things as open parlays, and there's more fancier stuff, but I'm not going to get into that. That's for more gamblers that really know what they're doing. Then you also have teasers. Now, this was my favorite, and a lot of people call these sucker bets. This is a sucker's bet. And what's fun about a teaser is that you can take you have to win all the games in it, but you can do a 2 or 3-team teaser are the most common. And what a teaser allows you to do is to manipulate the spread, the point spread. So what happens is let's just say you like a favorite and they are a 10-point favorite. Well, you have to pick 2 games now to do this. Okay, you have to pick 2 games, but you're allowed to manipulate the point spread 6 points in your favor in the 2 games. So if you have a team that is a 10-point favorite, you now knock them down to a 4-point favorite. You understand how that works? 10 down to 4, 6 points taken off. If you have, let's say you like an underdog, you have to pick 2 games, remember, in your teaser to do this. You like an underdog. That underdog is only a 1-point underdog, plus 1. In your teaser, if you like that underdog, you can now make them a plus 7. You take 6 points in your favor. The 1 goes to a 7. So that is what a teaser is. It's very, very simple explanation, and it's a very simple bet. You have to win every part of it. If one of the games loses, you lose. If you want to do a 3-team teaser, those are actually 10 points in your favor. So you can take the Patriots, who are let's say they're a 10-point favorite against the Colts. You can take them now from a 10 and put them down to a 0. Follow how that goes? 10 points in your favor. Let's say you like the Rams. The Rams are a 4-point underdog, though, to the 49ers. They're favored to lose by 4. Well, now you can add 10 to them. Again, you have to pick 3 teams in this, but you can add 10 points to that and make it now a 14. So now, in order to win that bet, the Rams can win the game outright or lose by 13 points or less. That's a lot of coverage. And that's what a teaser is. And there's also funky teasers and silly bets like that. You also have what are called round robins and if bets. and they're more exotic sorts of bets. There's a lot of exotic open-ended bets and ways to do things, but the most common bets that you're going to really come across are straight bets, whether it's on a game or on an over-under, straight bet, teasers, and parlays. That's usually the most typical. So that gives you an idea of your typical betting games and whatnot. Now, the other thing is, with this whole kind of gambling 101, is not getting into the trap of chasing your losses. Sometimes if you lose, it's okay. Sometimes you have to just take the loss. It doesn't mean that you have to bet every game to try and get back. That's when you get into the quicksand. And that's when you start to bet out of desperation. And again, when you're just betting on the only game that's on TV at that time, maybe it's not worth betting. Maybe it's that hard of a matchup. It could be really difficult to find a winner in that. So one of the things that I was going to mention before that these bookies taught us was why college betting was better than NFL betting. Number one, as far as football goes, and basketball as well, but college football, why it was better was because with college football, you have a slate of 40, 50 games. And in that slate of 40, 50 games, you have more mismatches. These spreads that they are creating are, sometimes they're not accurate, okay? Sometimes those spreads are not truly indicative of who's better and who's not. So you can find value when you're looking through the college spreads as opposed to the pro. Keep in mind, one of the things with these point spreads that you see is that they are what the public perception is, okay? All right? They're what the public perception is for who they think is better as opposed to the other. It's not necessarily who it really is better. There are ways to grade these teams and rate them. I'm going to get into that in a second. There's an actual mathematician that came up with an algorithm that how to rank these teams and to subtract one team's number from the other to truly tell what the point spread should be. It's called a Sagarin rating. Jeff Sagarin came up with a formula, and he's been doing this for many, 20, 30 years. So the Sagarin rating is really key to knowing, to kind of finding your value. But the difference is that college football has so many more games to find value in. And you don't have to take that Clemson-Florida State matchup. You don't have to take that Florida-Bama matchup. That's the fun game to watch and bet, but not if you're trying to win money. Sometimes if you're trying to win money, you want to take that Duke-Northwestern game. Okay? So you have to understand that there is tremendous more value in college football. You will see bigger disparities. If you put in Sagarin ratings with college teams, and you can get Sagarin on the internet, it's readily available, and when you put in that number, you'll see, wow, why is BYU a 17-point underdog? The Sagarin rating shows them as only 4 points different from this team. Well, then you can trust in that. Like, wow, they seem like a very heavy dog. There may be a lot of value here on BYU. Now, there's other factors you want to, read into and look at. Injuries matter. Home field matters. Weather matters. There's all sorts of factors. A lot of these things are X's and O's. They're just calling plays against each other that these guys are running. They're set plays with set routes and set blocking. Everything is set. And it's a matter of who can execute it better, but whose play beats the other play. It's literally like a war strategy. Every play is like matriculating down the field as if you're almost like in war trying to capture the other team's flag. So it's who's calling the better X's and O's at that point. So that's usually one of the cross-out factors. Injuries, better talent, better coaching. These are all factors as well for all of these things, especially in college. Deeper teams is a big thing in college. Alabama literally has a starter and second string that's better than a lot of teams' first string. So a lot of teams are just deeper than other teams. Smaller schools tend not to be deep. They may have talent on one level, but they have no second, third stringers at any position that have any talent. And that's usually also why they're worse. So that gives you a good kind of primer into the gambling. Is this a good halfway point, you think? So we're going to take a break right now. You're listening to the Mr. Josh Podcast. You can hear me on Spotify, iTunes, Buzzsprout, all that good stuff. We got Jesse behind the ones and twos, engineering another great show. We're going to get into fantasy football after the break, and we'll be right back. Thanks for listening.
Hello, America. We are Ruthless Politics, Vladimir Putin's favorite podcast.
Hello, American podcast listeners. I am Vladimir Putin. I like this podcast. I like this guy Trees. Kid Groening, not so much.
Tune in every Tuesday for Ruthless Politics Podcast, live from Moscow. Just kidding, folks. Live from the Space Coast Podcast Studios in sunny Florida.
No, but for real, every Tuesday, check it out. And you could see it on the YouTube, the Facebook, and the Twitter and Instagram.
Hey, Lightning.
What's up, sunshine?
I am so excited about our new show.
Oh, yeah? Well, what are we going to talk about? Real estate?
Of course.
How to get a mortgage?
Yep, for first-timers and experienced owners.
What about the best place to get a drink on the beach?
Lightning, come on. Who would know better than us?
All right, I dig it. Plus, I know we're going to bring in tons of great local guests, tell jokes, and talk about some of the hottest listings to hit the market.
Oh my God, I can't wait. Sunshine and Lightning over Brevard will have new shows every Sunday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, streaming live from the beautiful Space Coast Podcast Studios.
And make sure you like our Facebook page, Sunshine and Lightning, Exit First Class Realty, and subscribe to Space Coast Podcast to make sure you don't miss out on any of our new shows.
Dig it.
All right, boom.
You're listening to Space Coast Podcast, home of the greatest podcasts on the Space Coast. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor or having your own show, email us at spacecoastpodcast@hotmail.com.
Space Coast Podcast.
Talk hard!
All right, guys, the Mr. Josh podcast back on the air. Gonna do the second segment here, segment number 2, número 2. Usted está pasando por la entrada del Delfín Azul. You are now entering the Blue Dolphin entrance at the Sawgrass Mills Mall. I memorized that. I've been there so many times. I memorized that. If you ever lived in Broward County, you know that. Listen, how good I do that. Usted está pasando por la entrada del Delfín Azul. Not bad. I have a very good linguistical ability, I've been told. So let's get into now the second part. Fantasy Football 101. Gambling's fun. And a lot of people like gambling. But fantasy football, let's fix the hair thing here. Let's Jufro City. Okay. So fantasy football seems to be something that captured people way more than gambling did. Fantasy football blew up like a motherfucker. I believe DirecTV had a big hand in why fantasy football grew and did so well and why it got so big. Everybody that liked fantasy football, so the difference is now you're no longer favoring a team. You're favoring a bunch of players. A higher interest level. I mean, think about it. That's just common sense. The NFL, everyone started to realize, wow. So you used to just like the Steelers because that was your team. But you got Brett Favre. And then you also got Eddie George as a running back. You know, I'm using older names. But you also got Barry Sanders. And you got Jerry Rice. And you've got Flipper Anderson. And you've got so-and-so. And I'm using old names. I could use current names. You know what I mean? Same thing now. You got Ezekiel Elliott. But you got Julio Jones. But you got Russell Wilson. Well, all these guys are on different teams. So now you're paying attention not to just one team, you're paying attention to all the teams. So it really exploded the interest level. DirecTV now gave you the ability to see all of these games at one time, and that never used to exist. As we know, if you still have to deal with network TV, all you had was your 1 o'clock game, your 1 4 o'clock game. Sometimes you didn't even have both of those. And then obviously your primetime stuff. Thursday night was primetime. And these rules have changed now. Amazon's gotten in and different ways to stream and all that. But back in the day, it used to be just you'd get one game, and there was no option of seeing other games anywhere. Even if you're going to a sports bar, pre-DirecTV, it wasn't like you weren't getting it at your house. You weren't getting it anywhere. So fantasy football really exploded. Fantasy football really exploded during the DirecTV years. And so how does fantasy football work? Well, it's very simple. It allows you, now there's some question of whether this is gambling or not. So it's funny how fantasy football has skated the rules, and this is where FanDuel and DraftKings comes in. And if you're familiar with those or not, we'll talk about them if we have time. But those became basically where fantasy football and gambling merged into one. The thing about fantasy football was that typically once you did one of these, you weren't going to see any cash or any winnings until the end of the year. So there was no real financial reward to playing fantasy football, certainly not any that were going to come too quickly for you. Some people would institute like a best score of the week where there was a weekly prize, so it added a little bit of fun for weekly money. But at the end of the day, fantasy football, there was no money going to be exchanged until the very end to the winners. And that's if you had multiple winners or not, first place, second place, third place, whatever. Typically, a league will have 12 teams. That's optimum. You'll see a lot of times with 10. Anything less than 10, the teams get a little too overloaded with, I just personally think that the teams are just too good at that point, and it's not quite as fun. So their strategy really becomes involved with fantasy. Some good CBD. The strategy is that the deeper the league is and the more teams there are, the more you got to really draft accordingly and be smart with your cuts and your moves because there's so many other people involved. Okay, so how does fantasy work? Basically what you're doing is you are taking the stats of the players, you draft these players, and then their stats become your stats, so to speak. And those stats translate into points. And those points are determine who wins and who loses. Now, there's two different ways you can draft teams, and there's two different ways that people play fantasy football. And this is what's kind of cool, too, because you have choices here. All right, so it also makes it easier for people that are novices in the whole game. So let's talk about the two different types of leagues. You have leagues that are head-to-head. So when you have 12 teams, you'll have typically 2 groups of 6 on each side. Sometimes you will have 4 groups of 3 divisions or whatnot. So everyone then plays each other head-to-head in like a division, much like the real NFL does it. Okay, and then you have where it's just you're not playing anybody. It's just accumulated points. All 12 teams, highest score wins the week. That's it. You're not playing against wins and losses. You're just playing on total accumulated points every week. Some people, I think many people prefer the head-to-head. So what it's done is then it's done on wins and losses to get into the playoffs. Whereas the one with the numbers, it's just the top 4 number getters go into the playoffs or whatnot. So it's an either-or scenario, but people tend to prefer the head-to-head. Once you decide you're going to do that, then you have, this is the bigger decision, you have whether you're going to do an actual draft of players or you're going to do an auction style situation. So what a draft is that anybody can pick anybody they want. It's just done in an incremental order. So 1 through 12, 12 through 1, 1 through 12, 12 through 1, and until you're done. The auction style is where you get in a allotted amount of money that's decided for every team, every player, and there's usually magazines and websites that will show you where, when you're doing it typically through a site, every player will have a monetary value assessed to them at the preseason value. Those values, by the way, change during the year based on how good or bad the player does. And you are now drafting a team according to an auction value. So you can't overload with stars because you're just not going to have enough money. It's like literally having a salary cap. So you only have an allotted amount of salary. So that's how fantasy is done in terms of your two different ways that you can actually do that. So what I also want to go over is I'm going to go over real quick because I have a good little primer here on some of these key terms that are, and then I'm going to expand on some of these as well. So if you're not familiar with some of these, and some of these you might be, what these are fantasy football key terms. So you'll hear the term ADP. ADP stands for average draft position. Average draft position. What that basically means is in any of these drafts that people are having, that number is indicative of where that player is typically going off the board. So it's giving you a good idea as a draft preparation tool. Like, don't think this guy is lasting too long. They're taking an average of drafts that are being done through their site, their portal, whatnot, and they're able to assess this guy's going number 1, this guy's going number 4, this guy's going number 11. So they take it's like a median of all of their draft positions. So that's what you'll see as ADP. Basic scoring, you'll hear, that's just, let's talk about the scoring. So typically the way scoring is, touchdowns have a 4-point value. When they're thrown by a quarterback, they typically have a 6-point value when they are scored any other way. They are typically lower for quarterbacks because they have the opportunity to score more touchdowns. It is very rare that you will see quarterbacks get 6 points in fantasy football. If you are in a league where the quarterback is getting 6 points for the touchdown, you're in a Mickey Mouse league, and it's not being done accurately or smartly for that matter. They should be 4 points. Interceptions are usually negative points, just like fumbles are. Rushing yards, typically it's fractional. So if they had 85 yards, it'll be 8.5 points for that. If a wide receiver catches for 130 yards, they will get 13 points for that. So that's how that's done. It's done on like a 1/10 fraction. Very, very easy to figure out. Nothing hard about that. So that's how yards are accumulated by your players. And then your receptions. You will have the ability to be in leagues sometimes that do what they call PPR leagues, points per reception leagues. If you're in a league that does not reward PPR receptions, I would not do that league. You want to pick players that are rewarded for that. I do not believe in getting a full point for that, like it's worth 10 yards. I think half a point is accurate. So if you're in a PPR league, it typically will be a half a point or 1 point if that running back or receiver catches a ball. So that's what a PPR is. Aside from PPR, you have your ways for kickers to score. And one way for kickers to score is extra points. They get 1. They'll lose a point for a miss. They lose points for missed field goals. And then they get their points for field goals as well. And field goal being 3 points for, I think, anywhere up to 39 yards, 4 points up to 49, 5 points for 50, and then so on. Some people reward, some people cap at 5. So that's how kickers get points. Then you also have a defensive special teams. So you're getting points for interceptions. Typically it's 2. You get 1 point for a sack is very typical. And then there's points typically for how many points they let up. Some leagues will do it where you get 10 points. If you keep it at 0, you get 10 points. That gets shaved down as they give up more and more points. I think once typically maybe they give up over 30, you get 0 points at that point for that. So the only way you'll accumulate points then would be getting interceptions, sacks, fumble recoveries, and whatnot. Those are all ways that you can score as well. So the scoring is pretty simple. There's not that many ways to gain points in fantasy football. Okay, so I think I pretty much went over that. I think I left off passing yards. The way passing yards, I did leave that off. The passing yards are usually accumulated in 25-yard batches. Sometimes you'll see 20, and they'll get 1 point for every 25 yards. Some leagues will give bonuses for hitting certain thresholds. So you might get a bonus if your running back rushes for 100 yards, they'll throw a bonus. Some leagues throw huge bonuses on for hitting these. I think that's a little overboard, but having a 5-point bonus for going over 100, 10-point for over 200 it makes sense. Quarterbacks getting bonuses for throwing over 300 yards is also common. Now, so you also have your bench. When you're drafting starters. Typically, your starters is 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, a tight end, typically 2 wide receivers. You will see leagues do 3. You'll see leagues also have a flex player, which can be a running back, tight end, or wide receiver. It's never another quarterback. It's never allowed, typically. By the way, all these rules can be tweaked or changed in any fantasy league. Anybody can do anything they want. There are no set rules here. It's like Monopoly. People play how they want, and it's up to you to go according to the rules. Sometimes I think that the rules are a little silly and they benefit the wrong things, so I wouldn't join leagues that have sometimes silly scoring and things like that. You have also your bench. So you're not only drafting your starters, it's very important to have your bench because those guys are going to have bye weeks or injuries and weeks that they don't play. And it's very important to have backup players that are also very good, that those players can be somebody that you put in. And those players also might be someone who eventually starts for you because they wind up being better than who you originally drafted. You'll hear the term bust. A bust is like you figure it is somebody that had a higher expectation statistically, and they did very poorly. Their stats were bad, and they were a bust. You went too high in taking them, and they did not pan out for you. Other players that were taken at that time, if you go back, panned out, and you messed up. The player you took did not pan out and get the points that you thought they would. So that's a bust. I mentioned bye weeks. What a bye week is very simple. It's the week that each team in the NFL gets a week off during the year. The NFL assigns that. It's very important that you check out the bye weeks so that you don't draft players that have the same bye weeks. Too many. You don't want to draft 2 quarterbacks that have the same bye week. If it's week 8, that would be silly. Now you've rendered your backup useless that week if you still have them. And now you have to get another quarterback to even play somebody. So you've put yourself kind of in a conundrum. That's something you want to pay attention to. The bye weeks are important. And all it is a week off. Every team gets one. Nobody does not get a bye week, but they are in different weeks, and they give them to multiple teams on at different weeks. You'll hear the term cheat sheet. A cheat sheet is just a paper or a list on the internet that has stats, player names, and different fantasy points and pointers and things like that help them get through the draft. You'll have a commissioner in your draft. Your commissioner is somebody who usually runs the whole thing. They usually run these many years in a row. They'll control where the money goes, how it's distributed, how it goes. And they're usually a trustworthy person and somebody that also is very accessible because you're going to want this person to be someone that can answer you if you have questions about the league or questions about cuts and trades and things like that. Cuts or drops. That's the next thing. If cutting a player is basically releasing a player from your roster and picking up another player. There are all sorts of different rules to this in different fantasy leagues, okay? When you can cut, when that time is, and if you're doing it online, that will be told to you right up front, and it's usually done in an order where the teams that are at their worst, it's a waiver wire, so the teams with lower records and that have lost, there's certain formulas that come into play. Those teams will always have first shot. Those teams will have first shot at those players that are available. So if you're in first place and you've won 6 in a row, you're never going to really be high on the waiver wire. Teams that have 12 teams in them or more, it's usually what's called a deep league. So that's when you hear the term deep league, it's letting you know, wow, there's a lot of teams in this league, usually 12 or more. Depth chart, just like in the NFL, you have your first string, second string, and third string, what's referred to as a depth chart. That basically is your better players, obviously, at the top, and your not as good players underneath. Sometimes you'll hear the term dynasty league. This is for people that are real experts in this. A dynasty league basically is a way that you can keep your whole team or certain players. Everybody has different rules on this, and that you get to keep them from year to year to year. People get very attached to their players, and they get very attached, and so as a result, they don't want to give them up. So they want to keep these players, and they'll join dynasty leagues where you get to keep them all the time, and then you can obviously cut and trade as you want any of those players that you still have. The flex spot, as I told you, typically it's not quarterbacks. Usually it's running backs and tight ends, but sometimes it's, running backs and wide receivers, but they'll also include tight ends typically. I think quarterbacks, silly to put in there, but sometimes people do. Let's see what else we got. Free agents are players that are not on the team's roster, so these are the players that are available. Every week you're going to have guys out there performing that are not on any teams, and people are going to want to pick them up. There's going to be hot players, and people will always have shitty players on their team, and that they may want to pick up somebody that's out there on the waiver wire that's doing well for their particular team that nobody drafted, nobody thought was going to do well, but here they are doing well in the NFL, and they'll wind up on a team at that point. Handcuffing. You'll hear this term a lot. People get injured. Players get hurt. It's quite often, especially running backs. So what a handcuff commonly is landing the backup to the player that you really covet. For instance, if you really, let's see, who would be the backup? I think, okay, so for instance, Le'Veon Bell is on the Jets this year. He's the number one. But the backup to Le'Veon Bell on the Jets, I believe is it Isaiah Crowell? It might be, yeah, Isaiah Crowell. I think he's there. And so he would be a good handcuff because, God forbid, Le'Veon Bell goes down. The next guy behind him is going to kind of take up all of that slack. I'm not a big handcuffing fan and wasting bench players on handcuffs. But if you do decide to do that in a risky situation or in a situation where the starter is not totally confirmed or not solid, a handcuff could be something that really pans out for you, and it could actually be something that could be very beneficial. It's a gamble. You also have injured reserve. Players get hurt. You'll have leagues that have different injured reserve rules, what you can do in terms of drafting, replacing that injured player, and how those rules work. That's just different from league to league to league. Okay, so like the Dynasty League, they also have what's called a keeper league. So this is what I should have made the determination, the difference of before. The Dynasty League is keeping your whole team. A keeper league is where you're just going to be able to keep a certain amount of players, and you know in advance how many you're going to be able to keep. So you can actually freeze a certain amount of players. It varies from league to league. They could do 2, they could do 3, they could do 6. It's always up to what everybody votes on. It's usually kind of a democratic thing. Some leagues that you'll join will just have a commissioner, and that commissioner will make up all the rules, and you don't really have a say. It's pretty much like if you join like a public league, that commissioner will just have something that basically says, this is the rules, this is how you are, join if you like them, don't join if you don't. You don't really have a democratic say in how the scoring or rules are going to be. Okay, so that's a keeper league. Mock draft, you will see, very common. One good way to study is to hold mock drafts. And mock drafts allow you to be able to see where people are going off the board, mistakes you may have made, ways to learn against what you might think you have done wrong. And it's just a very good way to test your chops. People love doing these drafts. So doing mock drafts is kind of a way, it's almost a little primer before you really do your big pop when you have your real draft, that's going to be for real money. So mock drafts are kind of fun when it comes to the whole buildup of the fantasy season. We went over PPR. Your rosters, obviously your team. And some people don't know these, but going over abbreviations, TD equals touchdown, FG equals field goal, XP equals extra point, INT is interception, PTS means points. These are all kind of basic statistical abbreviations that everybody probably should know anyways. So as you know, like these whole things are based off stats. So stats is a common term you'll keep hearing all the time. Stats, stats, stats. A stud. So a stud is somebody that Julio Jones is a stud. Pat Mahomes is a stud. So you'll hear it like a horse, where these guys that are putting up huge numbers every year, they're considered the studs. There are certain players that you just know are going to do good, and they routinely do good. And it's up to you to land those players. It's up to you to land the one that definitely does good and that doesn't have that bad year. Sometimes it's a gamble you want to be careful. Let's fix this over here. Okay. So sometimes you want to be careful when you draft. A couple of points of advice is players that change teams. You want to be careful sometimes when you take players that change teams, because you don't know how that's going to go for them. This is a new situation, new quarterback, new offensive playbook. So while that can be a benefit, sometimes finding players that are going to new teams, for instance, Odell Beckham in Cleveland, you really don't know what to expect. This is especially true with quarterbacks, by the way. So you want to be careful with players that go to new teams. One thing we're also learning is the running back position in the NFL right now is kind of being withered away. There's probably 10 to 12 teams, give or take, that are running back one solid back, that they're not running back by committee. So you're seeing a lot of teams that are splitting their running backs carries. So you're not getting a set solid running back situation. So that's something to be careful with as well, because you're really not sure which back is going to necessarily get the lion's share of that work. So another thing to always pay attention, you'll see that these backs, the ones that are solid, they're coming off the board immediately. So you got to really pay attention to the running back position, because the running back position gets very thin very, very fast. So that's one of the changes that's also happened that you see in the league. You'd be surprised how much kickers can make a difference. I believe in getting a solid kicker. The kicking in the NFL, if you paid attention, has gotten worse and worse. They continuously miss 40-yarders. The amount of players that can kick 50-yarders, it seems to have thinned out. I don't know what's happened. Maybe more and more people are sticking with soccer. But the kicking in the NFL, for the level and how important the games are, is atrocious. I've watched this league for many, many years. The Morton Andersons are gone. The Jason Elams are gone. There are very few quality kickers in the league. As a matter of fact, this crop of kickers is the worst we've ever seen. More and more younger guys. That's a position that a lot of guys play into their 40s, and we only see a handful of these older kickers, and it just goes to show you it's something strange that's happened, and I'm surprised that more emphasis hasn't been put on it, because kickers are a way to put points on the board. They're one of the few ways that you can put points on, so they're good for 3 points. Imagine that you have to drive down the entire motherfucking field and matriculate your way down to get 6 points, when this guy can just kick it through for half of that. So it's a very valuable thing that people just don't seem to put as much emphasis on. Remember, that 7 points that you get for a touchdown, one of those is the responsibility of your kicker's foot. So you're really only getting 6 points of what the team is contributing. So think about that. It's only half of what the whole team's contributing is being brought to you by one guy. And you'd be surprised that the Bears will be the first one to told you they missed going to the fucking Super Bowl over their kicker missing a 41-yarder. And I don't know if you know this, but this offseason so far, the Bears were trying new kickers out. And I think they brought in 7. I'm not sure. And let's see if I can pull it up. And what they did was they bring in kickers. There you go. So on June 12th, 2019, the Bears cut one of 3 kickers after another embarrassing round of the Cody Parkey challenge. So what the Cody Parkey field goal challenge was they brought in kickers. Sorry, it was 42 yards. I was a yard off. They brought in kickers to replace Cody Parkey. And all they asked them was to come in and kick a 42-yarder. More of them missed it than made it. These were people auditioning for a kicker job. Can you imagine that? Yeah, that's amazing. That's how bad the kicking is. The Bears basically said, we will give you a shot at being the kicker of our team. It says here, Tuesday, Matt Nagy gave all 3 of his kickers a chance to make the field goal from 42, 1 yard closer than Parkey's miss that ended their season prematurely. Similar to how 6 of the Bears' 8 kickers at rookie minicamp failed to make their 43-yarder. I just repeat that again. 6 of 8 missed it. By the way, that's how hard it is. Have you ever kicked a ball through uprights in your life? It's hard, right? People don't know this. If you ever get a chance, we had a close buddy that actually had upright. He was a good kicker. He had uprights. His father put uprights in their backyard. So we got to practice like at his house. So a lot of people don't get this kind of practice because the only way you're going to get to do this is on an actual field that has uprights. It is extremely hard to kick a football through uprights. First of all, to get the trajectory up, most people can't do. Even athletic people, they cannot kick right with their foot. They just do that. It just goes forward in some wobbly old manner. You know what I mean? And it just goes off into the distance. Kicking a football through uprights is hard, man. And then to be able to do it through skinnier uprights. I believe the NFL is even skinnier than high school and college, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like it. Maybe it's not. But to do it from such a distance is hard, no doubt. But on the flip side, if you're an NFL kicker or you're even auditioning to do this, this is something you practice and do every day at least 100 times, at least. So it becomes second hat. So for them, it's definitely not about the trajectory anymore, getting the ball up off the ground. They know how to do that, but it's that aiming. It's being able to aim it. And, and then obviously the pressure. That's the closest thing to golf pressure. Golf, people get the yips or it gets in their head or whatever and they miss easy shots. Same thing at the free throw line. There are certain things that just it gets in your head, but kicking is way more than a free throw. Free throw is 1 point and pretty much fucking insignificant. But every field goal matters in that game. Again, they're getting half of what a touchdown gets you. I find it's very discounted. I also learned when I was going back to the gambling thing that college kickers are even worse. I was surprised when I gambled how many good schools had bad kickers. And I remember Notre Dame particularly was one that seemed to figure like, we'll never give a scholarship to a kicker. They'll never give that spot to a kicker. I don't believe in that at all. I think that's foolish. There's an anti-kicker thing, like because they're not one of the tough guys and they're not in the trenches and all that shit. I can respect that. That's fine. But if you're talking about wins and losses and points, all that fucking macho shit don't matter. It's not about trenches. It's about points. And he can put points on the board. Your offensive tackle cannot put points on the board. I don't care how many fumble rooskies you run. But at the end of the day, college, and it may have gotten better. I don't particularly think it has, because these college kickers are not translating into the NFL very well. But what I did learn in all that time was that college kickers were notoriously bad, especially at big-name schools. I was very, very surprised by that. I learned it because I would bet on all these different games or pay attention to these different games and things I never used to watch before and be like, wow, Clemson's like ranked number 7 in the country. Their kicker's terrible. Notre Dame, their kicker's terrible. He couldn't be counted on to go make a 33-yarder. So that's a really, really bad sign. And I never understood how big schools will actually allow something like that to happen with their kicking game. Yeah. Let's wrap this up here, folks. You are listening to the Mr. Josh podcast. I cover a lot of different stuff. Why am I doing this football episode? Because I'm going to routinely talk fantasy during the year. I'm going to do a preview show when the season starts getting closer. We're going to go over all the divisions, the conferences, AFC, NFC, go over all the divisions. I'm going to give a rundown gambling-wise. I'm going to give a rundown fantasy-wise. I do not watch sports anymore except for the NFL and college football. So those are the only ones that I pay attention to. And I am highly, highly knowledgeable. I'm not trying to sell you picks or whatever. I'm just going to give you good info week to week. I follow shit very closely. And I think that I have a good grasp on all of it and that I can be very helpful to you. So this was kind of an introduction to the fact that I'm going to be doing that. We took a couple weeks off, maybe a week or so. We're going to get back on a regular schedule. Remember, I also do Ruthless Politics with Kid Chronic. A political broadcast that will knock your fucking socks off. It's good stuff, and considering how ruthless it's supposed to be. Oh, I touched that. I don't even know why. But we do play nice. We're right now coming from the Space Coast Podcast Studios in Central Florida. It's so hot and sticky. That's why you got to go inside and listen to a podcast, pour lemonade over your head, do whatever you got to do. This is Mr. Josh signing off. Another fun time. Hope you enjoyed and learned something. We're out. Peace.